and welcome to our reflections on the upcoming scriptures for this week, which begins, this time is the second Sunday. Now, sometimes this is called ordinary time or regular time. It's the time this season between the Christmas season and the beginning of the Easter season, which will take place in the middle of February this coming year. So for the next couple of weeks, we will be listening to readings that portray Jesus as he is referred to in the gospel tradition of Matthew. However, having said that, on this second Sunday, the gospel reading comes from John, chapter 1, verses 29 through 34. The first reading comes from Isaiah, chapter 49, verse 3, and then verses 5 and 6. And the second reading is the first section from the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. We will have occasion as we move along in these discussions to look at that letter of Paul to the Corinthians, which is perhaps one of the more interesting and in a certain way formative letters in terms of Christian tradition. All right, so why are we listening to John in this year of Matthew? And I give a little bit of a background of the Johannine tradition. Let me give an answer to my question before I go into a further discussion. I think that this particular reading is chosen this time because in the synoptic tradition, Jesus chooses 4 disciples to be his followers. I will make you, says Jesus in the opening of Mark, and Matthew also says this, fishers of men or fishers of people. And the first set is Peter and Andrew, who are brothers. And in that sense, the synoptic tradition presents the call of Peter in a certain way as the first. I'm going to suggest that in John's gospel, the call of Peter comes in a different way than it does in the synoptic tradition. And that may be one reason why this little section from John's gospel is chosen for our consideration this week. I can only make that as a supposition. In the tradition of the fourth gospel, it begins, and the Johannine gospel is very aware of Hebraic traditions, that God in the beginning had created, and the creation of the world, if you remember, according to one of the traditions, took place in 7 days. God created in 6 days, and on the 7th day rested. So 7, of course, has symbolic meaning, but also kind of important meanings about beginnings. John's gospel in chapter 1 also flows through 7 days. See, so I'm going to say, and what are those 7 days, just to highlight them, and then we'll come back to look at the one that we're looking at this time. Day 1 begins with John the Baptist being pictured as a witness to the teachings that are going to be concerned with the Messiah. That's important in the fourth gospel. Witnesses are who are very important. In fact, we will see that John the Baptist turns out to be an impressive witness. Now, it's important here, and I know this is perhaps a little different for us in the 21st century, that in ancient Israel, trials were decided by the leading men of the city or synagogue who administered justice at the gates. They did not investigate facts, but rather made decisions on the admissibility and competence of witnesses who spoke either in defense of or against an accused person. The person who could muster the most impressive array of witnesses usually won. So notice this is very different. When we speak of trials, we say, let's look at the facts. Let's get all the information to figure out what actually happened, when it happened, where it happened, how it happened, etc. That's not the way in which trials worked in the first century world. It worked on the basis of witnesses. And what witnesses could you get to support your situation, your case, and how strong was the personal witness information in deciding and in determining the outcome of the trial. So see, this is very different than perhaps we watch, kind of programs and Law and Order kind of programs in which things work on the facts that you can present. Not, or as one of those of you of a very early generation might remember, there was a detective named after one of the days of the week, namely Friday, Sergeant Friday, who would say, all we want now are the facts. We don't want your opinion. Well, that's almost the opposite of the way in which things worked in the first century world. And so my point here is that in the Johannine Gospel, also probably true in other writings too, it's the witnesses that are important. And in this case, John, the baptizer, is a witness. In fact, we will see that he is an impressive witness. He bears witness to the light. And I'll just quote a little bit here, chapter 1, verses 7 through 8. He is one who witnesses to one who is not me, but who is coming after me. And this is in, all of these are in chapter 1, verse 15. He witnesses, to Jesus as the Lamb of God. Witness, 29 and 36. Witness that he sees the Spirit of God on Jesus, verses 32 through 33. And in the end, John will declare that Jesus is the Son of God. So all of this is important in day one. So what I'm suggesting here is the seventh day arrangement. In day one, John says, I am not the Messiah. Who are you, they ask. Well, I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. See, so that's day one. Day two is that Jesus passes by. These are the verses that we're looking at this time. We'll come back to this, a statement. Day three, verses 35 through 42, where John says to two of his disciples, there's the Lamb of God. Maybe you want to check him out. They do check him out. And Jesus, as he is going along and they come up behind him, turns around and their question to him is, where do you live? And Jesus says, come and see. Now, what is important here is that they, I'm looking a little ahead of the story here, but in chapter 3, or on day 3, they stay with Jesus, and then one of those two who stay with Jesus, named Andrew, goes and gets his brother, Peter, and says to him, come and see the one that we have been looking for. And Andrew brings Peter to Jesus. So notice how this is different from the way in which Matthew, Mark, and Luke present the call of Peter. And then when Andrew brings Peter to Jesus, he says, well, you are Simon, and I change your name to Peter. And that's how the call, if you want, of Peter to discipleship takes place in the fourth gospel. Day 4 now pictures Jesus as already in the Galilee. He, at this point, deals with another one of the disciples, Philip, has said to his friend Nathanael, look, I think I found the Messiah. Nathanael is pictured as saying a famous saying that's later quoted, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And then you can kind of get back to this story. Nathanael becomes a disciple, okay? Then, so that's day 4. Then it says 3 days later. So now you get the arithmetic. 4 and 3 give you 7. And that finds Jesus at a wedding feast at Cana of Galilee, where, as we are aware, the water is changed into wine. Now I give that little background because that's the way in which the opening section of the fourth gospel takes place. In other words, if you take the 7 days, you have really, by the time that the 7th is finished and you come to the 8th, a new day, a new time, a new creation, a new beginning. And it's at that point that in John's gospel, the ministry of Jesus begins. All right, so I give you all that a little bit of background because the placing of this episode of John's gospel for our consideration this time is sort of short in a way, because the way in which it works is Jesus, or John rather, is pictured there as teaching, or whatever he was doing, baptizing, and he points out as Jesus walks by, there is the Lamb of God. And witness, notice that what he is doing, another way to be a witness is something, I have mentioned this before, that I'm sure your parents told you should not do. Don't point, okay? Well, that in fact is what John is doing, points out, there is the Lamb of God. Now, is Jesus just walking by? Why is he there? And John then says, well, I saw the heavens open, and the Spirit of God came upon him. And John declares that Jesus is the true Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Now, I may have mentioned this before. Notice that the phrase is not the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, which seems to be part of the liturgy and the pattern of speaking that we use in our prayer life. But it is to take away the sin of the world. Now, why is this important? Because sin here needs to be understood in what we would say a cosmic way, in a way that includes the whole of creation or the whole of the world. See, when you talk about sins, then you can determine it to individual persons or even to individual group. Israel is guilty of sins. Henry, just as an example, is guilty of sins. So as we take it, it becomes very personal. But as it is found in the teaching of John, sin, as I say, has the universal aspect here. And when John points to Jesus and says, "There is the true Lamb of God," well, that raises another question. What does the reference that John makes to Jesus as the Lamb of God? Now, the most likely, and by the way, this is one of the more interesting discussions that take place by those who interpret things. What is the reference to Lamb of God that the writer has in mind here? Some think, although this seems to be a minority view that isn't used too much today, that he's simply referring to the fact that in the temple, regularly the priests in charge there would offer lambs to God in sacrifice. This was done on a very regular basis by the assigned priest, and that was their task. But others, and the more regular now and popular interpretation, here refer to Jesus as the Passover lamb, and see this as having something to do with the end of Jesus' life or with the Passion narrative. One will remember, again, jumping around a little bit, but you have to stay within this discussion, at least the Johannine tradition, that in the Johannine tradition, Jesus dies on the cross at the very hour in which the Passover lamb in the temple was being sacrificed. So is that the reference now that is being made here? Here is the Lamb of God, and that is Jesus is the Lamb of God, the stainless Lamb of God, who will bring salvation not simply to individuals, but will bring salvation and healing to the world. In other words, a kind of new creation. And keep in mind, 7 days God created, 7 days, a new beginning. So all of this in some ways may well be connected with the image of the Lamb of God that John likes to use here, okay? So as Jesus' death and resurrection, always keep in mind, again, in the Johannine tradition, we need to be careful that we do not separate Jesus' death from his resurrection, that they are very much connected. We have pointed this out earlier on in other discussions when, for the Johannine writer, the culmination of Jesus' life takes place on Calvary. But, and it is there that both the death of Jesus happens, but also the beginning of the church, the announcement of resurrection has also taken place. Perhaps that's information for another and further study, but since this time the Johannine Gospel is given us, we do have to kind of work a little bit with what this is. So notice here in day 2 that we are looking at this time, and as you will see, John, in giving his witness, says, in the beginning, I did not know him. See, now, keep in mind, we need to interpret only the 4th gospel here. Don't bring in information you know from Luke or from Matthew. But John says, I didn't know him. How did I know him? God pointed him out to me. The Lord. I saw the heavens, etc. Okay? So it's an interesting kind of moment. How strong was any relationship that John had with Jesus? He passes him by. Where is Jesus going? Where is this home that he is staying at? So there are other kind of questions that we might raise that are not important, but that are interesting when we speculate a little bit upon this. But the point, again, that we're making is John is the witness, and he is perhaps one of the stronger witnesses in a gospel that has much to do with witnessing to the reality of who Jesus is and what God is doing through and with Jesus. Excuse me. All right, so there's the gospel. The first reading from Isaiah 49, we have mentioned this work before. Remember that Isaiah is divided into 3 sections. This section comes from the second section, which includes what we call servant songs, and the one that we're looking at this time is the second of 4 servant songs. And in this servant song, Israel is identified as the servant. So the servant's mission, at least according to Isaiah, this second one, is to Israel, to bring it back from exile and to gather it to the Lord. So keep in mind that Christians and we, and of course in choosing certain sections of Isaiah, apply it to Jesus, but what we can kind of assert here is that in its original context, it has to do with the nation. So it has certainly a corporate idea that God, and at the time in which this was being written, will bring back those who are in exile. Now, the exile, of course, had been a traumatic moment in Jewish life. We've noticed this on many occasions, and it does affect a number of ways in which things were thought. This would be second Isaiah. Keep in mind that the 3 Isaiah writers, whether they knew one another, we don't know, but the writer of the second and third uses the kind of dynamic of first Isaiah, and so engages here in what is known as prophetic speech, and that the Lord will bring back those who are exiled to their homeland. And that, of course, would be inspirational and hope-filling for those who lived in exile. Now, what we will notice, as bad as exile is always portrayed in the Hebrew Bible, some of those who actually went into exile may not have been as happy or as excited in returning from exile as the prophets had hoped. I think I've mentioned this before. When they went into exile, they went into the land of Babylon, and they were settled in the area of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which were pretty fertile areas where crops could be grown. And although those who were driven from their land were now in exile, away from the place where they had grown up, or their children were born in exile, it wasn't a terribly difficult place to be living in. This had happened. The Babylonians, you remember, had taken over from the Assyrian government and created their capital. But when Babylon fell to the invading armies of Persia, and the Persians later would say, it's okay for those who were driven from their land to return home to their homeland, were not so eager to leave the nice place that they had grown accustomed to living in, even though the rule was over the Persian government and not over the leadership of God as, who were leading the Israelites in exile, who were their leaders. Sometimes we're not quite sure who gathered the people and kept them together. There's a lot of fill in the blanks that go on here that we're simply not too aware of. But anyway, the idea would be we would gather together from all the lands, all the dispersed Israelites would come back again to their land, to the land that God had given long ago to Abraham and David, etc. So that was the hope, and that was the kind of inspiration. All right, well, that's pretty much all that one can say right at this point about the importance of Isaiah here. Of course, as Jesus would come on the scene, he would not simply be returning Israel to its homeland, but he would be also inviting, as we have seen, outsiders to also be part of this new experience, which would be led by none other than Jesus. So we are, as I say, looking this time at the second day. I mentioned earlier on that the third day pictures the call of Andrew and Philip. The fourth day finds the call of Nathaniel, and the fifth, sixth, and seventh day bring us to the story of the first sign that Jesus works at Cana of Galilee. In some years, this miracle or this sign of the changing of the water to wine is the third aspect of the Epiphany idea, which we have been looking at over the last couple of weeks. Remember that there are three manifestation stories: the Magi, the baptism of Jesus by John, and the sign at Cana. So perhaps this is an appropriate way to bring to an end this little section by saying that Jesus pictured at Cana of Galilee bringing his disciples to this wedding. Now, who exactly are the disciples that Jesus is bringing to the wedding feast at Cana? That we don't hear. We can imagine that it would be Peter, Andrew, Philip, maybe Nathaniel. Were there others at this point? I just add this in as a little kind of reflection at who exactly was present when this first sign was worked. And the changing of water into wine, of course, we have noticed. If water is important, and you could have water or wine at dinner, all of you would take water, I know, because, but wine, of course, is richer and fuller, and therefore, this sign of water to wine, a new beginning, a new start, and I suppose in reflection, a wedding, a marriage is a new beginning for the couple, and in some ways, a new beginning for the family. Keep in mind that in the ancient world, weddings were and marriages were very involving of the larger family. So if all of these were indications of new beginnings, one can see the connection here that the Johannine writer makes with the sign that is worked at Cana, and that the witnesses in a gospel that is important to witness would be those disciples that Jesus brought with him to this wedding feast. The regular people who were there were probably all villagers and interconnected. The outsiders most likely would be the members that Jesus was bringing to this event. Well, there you have it, our second week. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.